Hello, good morning, and welcome to Classroom. This is an eSnack initiative, and I thank all the viewers for encouraging us to do more and more classes, and we are overwhelmed by your response. Thank you so much. And today, we got an important topic: intraoperative neuromonitoring. We're going to discuss on the anesthetic challenges of intraoperative neuromonitoring. We believe that intraoperative neuromonitoring decreases the postoperative neurological deficits, and it's being increasingly used in so many centers across the world and in the country. Although there are no outcome studies to prove that it definitely improves the neurological outcome in these patients, it's being used in various parts of the country in various centers. And it poses an unique anesthetic challenge in that so many anesthetic agents what we use will have an impact on the signals. And now let me invite our faculty, Dr. Nitin from Hyderabad,
Good morning,
who
sir.
is going to. Hi, Nitin, how are you?
Good morning, sir. I'm fine.
Yeah, I hope you are using a lot of intraoperative neuromonitoring and you yourself do intraoperative neurophysiology as well. So it will be very
Yeah.
exciting to have you on board today.
Thank you,
Welcome,
sir.
Nitin. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Along with Nitin, I have got Dheeraj, who has done a review of literature. Hi, Dheeraj. He's
Good
from
morning, sir.
Bangalore. And Dheeraj will, I think, you will have a good stuff for us today. And
Yeah.
I welcome our regular customer, Dr. Ajay. Hi, Ajay. How are you?
Sir, I'm good, sir.
I'm glad to introduce Dr. Gopalakrishnan from Bangalore. Hi, GK. How are you?
Good morning, sir. Good morning to all.
And again, our boss, Dr. Prasanna. Hi, Prasanna. Direct from your office. Okay. All right. Okay. Let me first go to Dr. Ajay. Dr. Ajay, my question to you is we regularly do uh, cases under general anesthesia. If there is an intraoperative neuromonitoring involved, will that affect your anesthetic technique?
Yes, it does affect our anesthesia technique,
Can you
and
explain? Yeah.
usually we in our center have multimodal neuromonitoring. We go for SSEP, MEP as well for brainstem evoked potentials, like that. So except for brainstem auditory evoked potential, when we are dealing with SSEP, MEP, we modify our anesthesia. We we prefer TIVA in our place with propofol TCI, and we go for opioid based adjunct this thing, and some of the consultants go for dexmedetomidine also as an adjunct, and we ensure that the no hypotensive episodes happen. Like it's always kept at the baseline the blood pressure, because especially when we are monitoring MEP, we have noticed that even a drop in systolic of under 100, the map does come down. So we are careful in titrating our blood pressure, and we by default don't use nitrous oxide in our center. So otherwise, nitrous has to be cut off
All
if we are
right.
going for inhalation. And the MAC is kept less than zero point 0.5 if inhalation is used. But most of the time we go for TIVA in our place, because
Okay.
all this affect our operative potential monitoring.
Okay. Okay, Dr. Nitin, you yourself does intraoperative neurophysiology. So, like Dr. Ajay said, can you just enumerate us what are the common modalities which you employ?
Okay. So first, I'd like to.
Just briefly, just
Yes,
briefly.
sir.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. First thing I would like to tell that without optimal anesthesia, there is no neuromonitoring. So you have to optimize your anesthetic techniques to get neuromonitoring. That is how important neuromonitoring. That is how important anesthetic titration is when you do neuromonitoring. So there's a lot of responsibility on the anesthetist doing the surgery for intraoperative neuromonitoring, and they should be in sync. The neurophysiologist or the neuroanesthetist and the neurosurgeon, the whole team has to be in sync, and there should be a lot of communication. So with this, I would like to tell that in our center we do neuromonitoring ourselves, and we feel it's better in that way because we know how to titrate our anesthesia. So we also know the physiology and how to do neuromonitoring. So it falls in place and it I mean there's a lot of sync going on in such way. For neuromonitoring modalities, the most common modality that is used is motor evoked potentials, because that is what we are actually worried about. So motor deficits, that is the most important and the most widely used modality. The second modality I would like to mention is SSEP, sensory evoked potentials. The advantage with sensory evoked potentials is that it is continuous, unlike motor evoked potentials where it is intermittent. So SSEP is the second most common modality used. And then we have other modalities like brainstem auditory evoked potentials, visual evoked potentials, cranial nerve monitoring, which are commonly used. So coming to surgeries, I would like to tell that there are some surgeries where you can use neuromonitoring, where it will give an advantage, like so many cases like spine, aneurysm, etc. But there are some surgeries where it has kind of become mandatory to do neuromonitoring. So they are like CP angle, intramedullary spine lesions, kyphoscoliosis, brainstem gliomas. Probably these are the kind of surgeries, tethered cords or spinal dysraphisms. So these are the kind of surgeries where definitely there has to be a monitoring neuromonitoring done, and it has become kind of mandatory now to do monitoring in these cases. So we are
All right.
going into an era where we have to, we'll encounter more and more of neuromonitoring into practice, and maybe we'll have to seriously think about titration of anesthetics also.
Yes. Dr. Prasanna,
Yeah. Yes. Yes.
do you think intraop neuromonitoring is mandatory all these cases? Or it's an option?
If you go by outcome studies, it is still an option.
All right.
If you say if you say standard of care, it is still an option.
Right.
But definitely it has an advantage when you do it.
Okay, so that's what everybody believes, and now the topic will be only anesthetic challenges. We are not going to discuss in detail whether intraoperative neurophysiology really improves the outcome of the patients. So Ajay has briefly enumerated that he will change his anesthetic technique, and Nitin also emphasized the fact that anesthesia is the backbone to conduct a very good neurophysiological monitoring. I will ask Dr. Dheeraj, how does he practice neuroanesthesia when there is a intraop neuromonitoring? What anesthetic technique you prefer based on the modalities?
So based on the, as Nitin told, most common is MEP monitoring, and as we do a lot of spine surgeries in our center, so in MEP monitoring we prefer total intravenous anesthesia.
So your technique is total intravenous anesthesia.
Total intravenous.
I'll quickly go to Dr. GK. Dr. GK, what is your technique in intraop neuromonitoring?
Yeah, definitely for when we are monitoring motor potential, we go for TIVA plus opioid based. This is very important because whenever patient has already a neurological deficit, so to elicit the motor response, we should go for TIVA. But in some institute, they're even using balanced anesthesia technique where they try to keep the inhalation MAC less than 0.5. This is true in case when there is no neurological deficit. But when there is already a neurological deficit, so better to go for a TIVA. That is, will get a good response actually.
So your technique is TIVA, propofol with fentanyl and avoiding neuromuscular blockade completely.
Yeah, neuromuscular blockade and inhalation agent.
Okay, all right. Dr. Prasanna, what will be your technique?
Whether it is SSCP or MEP, totally TIVA.
Okay.
I don't want anybody to blame me that because of your anesthetic technique, we are not getting the recordings. 100% what they want will be given.
All right. So if I remember correctly, during my college days, when I was in trainee, absolute immobility, for the purpose of absolute immobility, always my teachers say, you keep, there is loss of neuromuscular blockade in neurosurgeries, even though neuromuscular relaxation is not required, but to keep an absolute immobility, especially in the brainstem surgeries and things like that, we used to go for a very deep level of neuromuscular blockade. But the things are now have completely changed. We want to elicit a good response from intraop neuromonitoring, and we go a relaxant-free technique. So how do you see this change, Dr. Prasanna?
Yeah, when you're doing neuromuscular, when you're doing these cases, initially we used to use the neuromuscular blocking agents. But still, when you are using the IONM, still some of the centers are going for partial neuromuscular blockade. So I don't think there is not much change. What you need is absolute immobility, whether you use neuromuscular blocking agents or not. So when when the surgeon is operating, you need immobility, which can be achieved with a good depth of anesthesia, even with intravenous or inhalation agent.
Okay, Doctor, I'm coming to Dr. Ajay. Dr. Ajay, when you say that in total intravenous anesthesia with opioid based, here whatever opioid we get is either fentanyl or sufentanil. So in most of the literature, what they've reviewed and the Western countries, most of the times the remifentanil are used. So how does that affect your practice? Using fentanyl, does it really delays the emergence of these patients, and how do you use that? How much
So
dose you use to achieve that to achieve a controlled ventilation and to give a balanced technique? What is your dose? How do you titrate fentanyl dose?
yeah, here we go for a continuous infusion of around 2 to 5 mics per kg per hour of fentanyl. So titrating according to the patient age and other factors. So we have found that anything above the range of 3 mics per kg per hour with good propofol, we go for TCI based propofol Schneider model. So any target of more than 3 is good enough to keep a patient immobile. And of course, during induction phase, we do use muscle relaxant. We go for either atracurium or vecuronium. And once after the positioning, especially in prone position, after the positioning, we check for the TOF. Once the TOF has come back, then we go for the baseline. Basically, anyway, the IONM is required during the surgical phase. So by that time, definitely we'll reach a TOF of 4 because it will take at least 1 hour for the surgeon to reach his area of interest. So muscle relaxant, we use that, and even at the end of the surgery, we once the monitoring phase is finished, we come down on our propofol as well as our fentanyl, and because we use BIS or we have this PSI also. So based on this, we titrate our anesthesia back to around to help in emergence, and we come down on our fentanyl to back to 1 to 2 mics per kg, and the patients usually come out beautifully at the end of the surgery. So I don't think use of intraoperative fentanyl during the time of monitoring is going to make a lot of impact compared to remifentanil, at least in our settings.
All right. I'll go to Dr. Nitin. Dr. Nitin, what will be user technique of induction, intubation, and then starting the anesthetic agents? Because you see, for intubation, especially in cases where it needs prone positioning, so how do you check whether the drop in signal is not due to improper positioning? Because if you're given a muscle relaxant, it's going to take some time. So,
sir, the first important thing is you have to understand what modality is being used. So for each modality, there is a different anesthetic titration that is required, because what is being monitored and what drug you are giving will be directly affected. So you have to look at the physiology of what is being done. Second thing is you have to identify critical steps. So in a cervical spine case, prone positioning itself will be a critical step. So at that time, you will probably have to give a small dose of relaxant just to intubate. Then you will have to probably, start getting your baseline before positioning, and then get a post prone positioning recording. So you have to identify what is the critical step, and then you have to.
So in this particular case of cervical spine surgery, prone positioning, can you use scoline instead of?
Good agent. You can probably intubate with scoline and then continue with TIVA. We induce with TIVA here. We do TCI TIVA. So once you give proper TCI propofol induction dose of TIVA, then we you can use a scoline, and sometimes you need not use scoline also. Without scoline, you can intubate a patient and then get a baseline. The important thing is to get a baseline and then position and then again get a recording, so that.
So what do you do in patients done prone? You get a routine baseline before turning prone?
Not routinely. I communicate with the surgeons when they feel that prone positioning itself will be a critical event for that patient. Then definitely we wait to get a baseline. The most important thing is to get a proper baseline recording. Only when you're happy with a proper baseline, then you do your prone positioning, and then get a recording again. So that is how it has to be done.
Having said that, for Dr. Prasanna, for your information, this is going to take time, isn't it?
Yeah.
So it is a time-consuming process, and we have to be. Yes. So do you do that routine baseline before
Yeah.
turning prone?
No, I think most of the cases we are doing after taking prone. I am. I think Ajay wants to make some point.
Yes. Yes. Yes, Ajay.
I do agree with Nitin for cervical cases and cervicomedullary cases. The baseline prior to positioning is required to get us a good idea as well as positioning related changes. But we use SSEP for such things, and SSEP usually is not affected. Actually, it is really we can get a good SSEP trace with the neuromuscular agent in situ. So. I don't think titrating a muscle relaxant at that point of time is going to change the thing. I think we can do away with the scoline part also, because these patients will be having prior neurological deficits, and scoline is relatively contraindicated in such scenarios.
Okay. So I'll catch on from this point. You mean to say that by that time the neuromuscular blockade already must have veered off, so there should not be any problem?
No, sir, because SSEP is being used for positioning related injuries as well as to confirm our this thing. SSEP is not affected by our muscle relaxant. Actually, you get a good SSEP with a muscle relaxant. So after the positioning, when the MEP stage comes, only we need to take off our muscle relaxant.
So I'll quickly go to Dr. Nitin. Dr. GK and Dr. Ajay both mentioned about in patients with a neurological deficit. So I just ask you in that context, in patients with already having a pre-existing deficit, will IONM help?
So IONM, I mean, you have to see your patients with for MEP like motor evoked potentials. If you have a power less than 3/5, very unlikely that you'll get a good baseline MEP. So the key is to get a good baseline recording. So even in a patient who's having deficit, in our institute, what we practice is we try to get an MEP. We try to get as well, I mean, the best response, and then we keep comparing it during the critical stages of surgery. Even in a patient with neurological deficit, you will get recordings. In some cases, you might not, but it's worthwhile trying it. And for Ajay's point, I would like to tell that you can do SSEPs for position-related injuries, but actually, when you're doing SSEPs, actually what you're monitoring is the dorsal column, and what you specifically are interested about is the anterior column, that is the motor tracts during your spine. So be very careful when you're doing SSEPs for cervical spine positioning. And initially, I'll tell you that initially when we started doing neuromonitoring 25 years back, for kyphoscoliosis, SSEP was the only modality then, but we have slowly moved on from SSEP to an era of MEP, because what we are worried about is motor deficits. So we want to look at specifically for motor deficits. So be very careful when you're taking into account SSEP and then going into monitoring. I mean, thinking that SSEP is okay and then position related changes.
Yes, Dr. Ajay.
See, we use both SSEP and MEP. For positioning related injuries, we go for SSEP, and MEP is done at the time of the surgical intervention. During positioning, I don't think MEP is going to make a difference in the positioning of the patient as well, because whether it's a posterior column or anterior column, during positioning, we are just making sure there is no spinal cord compression, especially at the C5, C6 area due to too much of flexion from the surgical side. So that is easily picked up by our SSEP, as well as for any brachial plexus injuries, any excessive stretching and all. SSEP is a better option because
for our CP angle surgeries, we regularly do position related injuries for brachial plexus. That is different. But for a spine surgery, you should be very careful when you're doing SSEPs and assuming that the motor deficits use both, but only doing SSEP will give you
during
false
positioning. I'm saying during positioning,
also you have to be very careful.
Have you noticed any changes in MEP after?
Definitely. You will get changes. If you are doing a critical cervical case, when you do prone positioning, you can have motor deficits. And so if you get your SSEP changes also, you will not be sure whether patient will have a motor deficit. So the surgeon will directly ask you whether I need to reposition again. So you have to be
But you will be
specific.
giving
You have to
some
do motor evok
anesthesia
potential.
drugs while you're pinning, and for your positioning, you will be giving anesthesia drugs. So doesn't
Okay,
that
Dr.
affect?
Prasanna. Dr. Prasanna, yeah, coming.
No, I just wanted to know from Nitin, which are those critical cases? Because the amount of effort what you take in minimizing the movement of the spine, and finally the final position is given by the surgeon. There is a hell lot of difference between the two.
Yeah.
So I really
So-
wonder what people think of this critical.
Yeah.
Because what are the, see, in a cervical spine, you please let us know what are the cases where you are going to use them, SSCP or MEP. Do you think a C4, C5 discectomy is there?
No.
ACDF?
No.
Do you think you are
I
going
will-
to use?
I will tell you, sir.
No,
In my
just-
practice, what Ponnaya sir was asking was exactly correct. In my practice also, when for positioning related, injuries and thing, it is only about maybe 5%. The most of the 95% of the patients we also position without, doing pre-recording and post-recording. It is only those 5%. You have to communicate with the surgeons. Most likely unstable cervical spines, okay, AADs, okay, these kind of cases, not the cervical intramedullary lesions, not discectomies, not those kind of, and lower cervical we don't worry much. It's the upper cervical that what mostly we are worried about.
So
All right.
Yeah.
Now what we'll do is we'll stop discussing this and we'll go to the anesthetic technique as such. And Dheeraj, everybody was saying that they'll modify the anesthetic techniques. So what does your literature say? Can we use a routine anesthetic technique, or we have to slightly modify our technique in order to get good signals?
I'll show my screen, sir. I'll show the effect of anesthetics on.
Yeah, please share that.
Okay. Yes.
And so almost everybody in the panel would like to use TIVA irrespective of what the case is. And Dr. Prasanna went one step ahead and say that it made the best technique because nobody can question him. Dr. GK, do you use TIVA in all the cases, or you do it under inhalation with reduced MAC and adding a bit of nitrous as well? Because Dr. Ajay said he is never going to use nitrous. So what is your institution's practice?
Yeah, definitely. Nitrous is not a good for neuromonitoring, especially motor evok potential, even for SSCP. So we avoid nitrous, and we prefer to go for TIVA. Okay. Only patient is fully preserved. He has no neurological deficit preoperatively. Then we can use balanced anesthesia technique where MAC you try to keep less than 0.5. At the same time, other variables like avoid hypothermia, maintain blood pressure, those things are very important.
So, but those things are in general, it is for all the cases, isn't it? It's not specific for neuromonitoring. Okay. Dr. Nitin, I think then it's very easy not to maintain anesthesia. Everybody is saying it's only TIVA and fentanyl. Then what's the big deal in the discussion?
No, it's very difficult, sir. I'll tell you that you'll be put in a very uncomfortable situation because most of us.
Oh, just one second. Dr. Dheeraj, start sharing your screen because I'm waiting for you.
Yeah.
Start
so
sharing your screen.
Most of us will be put into an uncomfortable position. Even I was. It's very difficult to do anesthesia for neuromonitoring because every time there is a signal change, you blame. Everybody looks at the anesthetist and then you have to tell them an answer that. So, TIVA is the most popular technique being used. TIVA with opioids. I think everybody has gone to TIVA now, and we have understood how to give better TIVAs. We have understood how to titrate our anesthetic. Depth of anesthesia monitoring modalities have helped us. So most of us have gone on to practicing TIVA. And I'll tell you one thing, sir, that probably doing neuromonitoring has made me a better anesthetist. Because before I used to use a lot of relaxant, and nowadays without relaxant, I know how to maintain. I've got better at maintaining anesthesia during surgery without patient moving. With only hypnotics and probably opioids and analgesics. So you get better. You understand that without relaxant also you can give very good anesthesia, and that's what most of the residents who come into my OT tell me that, sir, it's surprising. I have never seen this without relaxant, whole case being done. So probably it makes us also better as an.
No, that's fine, Nitin. My question is, because everybody uses TIVA with fentanyl and it's made anesthetic technique very simple. So what's the big deal we are discussing?
No. So TIVA, sir, you should understand that every modality, there is different anesthetic titration involved. Okay, so when you're doing only motor evoked potential,
One second, Dr. Dheeraj,
Sir,
share your
can
screen.
you, sir?
I'm waiting for you. Share your screen.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, go ahead, Nitin.
So
Sir,
I have some
are you able to
slides.
see, sir?
No, we're not able to see. Yeah.
1 second, sir.
Yeah.
Now, sir?
Yes.
Yes.
Put your
Then
slides. Yeah. Okay, Nitin, you go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you see the slides, sir?
Yes. Make it full screen. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll come to you. Yeah.
Okay,
Yes,
sir.
Nitin.
Yeah. So like I was saying, I mean, optimal anesthesia, I mean, providing optimal anesthesia is a very big challenge. So, I mean,
No, that's
all
fine.
the-
That's fine, Nitin. Now everybody agreed that an optimal anesthetic technique for TIVA offers the best advantage. Okay. In TIVA, do you have problems? If your TIVA, your depth of anesthesia is too deep up to level of burst suppression, or if you monitor the depth of anesthesia, what will be your numbers? Or you like that other day we discussed, you don't go based on number based things, or rather go for other indices of monitoring the EEG. So now, what level of TIVA is good for getting a good signal?
So I use TCI based propofol. That is TIVA.
Okay.
I use with propofol,
Okay.
and I titrate it according to depth of anesthesia monitoring. I use either entropy or BIS, and definitely I use raw EEG also. So with the same CORS2 electrodes that are put for neuromonitoring, you can pick up EEG signals. And sometimes when the BIS and entropy comes out, so these are the challenges that you face.
Yes,
Sometimes
yes.
the BIS or entropy comes out, and then you have to provide optimal TIVA so the patient does not have awareness. So that time we use raw EEG signal. I'll show you. I have some slides and I'll show you how we do that.
Okay. So if you use BIS or entropy, what is your number you titrate?
It's about above 40, definitely above 40. I don't want to go below that because it's unnecessary to go below that. It is somewhere between 40 to 60. That is my range.
Okay, Dr. Prasanna, your range, how do you do that?
40 to 50. I want to keep a little bit deep patient. Definitely not at 60. When it comes to 60, the risk of movement or awareness increases.
So what is your fentanyl dose? How do you titrate fentanyl?
Fentanyl, as routine, what we use, I give, because I am worried about the post-operative recovery also.
So how do you put on infusion?
No, the boluses only.
Oh,
fentanyl boluses, propofol in the infusion.
Oh, only boluses you use. Okay, Dr. Ajay, you do the same?
No, sir. We use fentanyl infusion, like I mentioned before, and we keep at range of 40 to 50.
40 to 50 is your number, yeah.
Dr. Skipping out on the muscle relaxant.
Okay, Dr. GK, what is your number?
Fentanyl, we 2 micrograms infusion.
Okay.
And other option is we use morphine also, actually, like 0.1 milligram per kg body weight. Every fourth hourly we'll repeat.
Okay, so you think that's enough?
Yeah.
Okay,
With
Dr. Nitin,
yeah. Sir, I routinely use morphine. Okay, I believe that it will avoid repeated bolusing of fentanyl, and it has given me good results. I bolus with fentanyl, and then I go on to a good dose of morphine, and I don't use infusion of fentanyl, but still it works well for me. And second thing is I use dexmedetomidine. So dexmedetomidine has changed practice. So it will give you hemodynamic stability, good analgesia. It will give you propofol sparing effect, multiple effects. So that is exactly what we want. So propofol along with dexmed and opioid boluses. That is my technique.
But by using dex, how do you titrate the number of BIS? Still you go with the.
So that is a question mark actually, because dex as such, the effects of dex on EEG and depth. It's not, because most of the action is subcortical. That is what is said. So I use it. I don't bolus with dex. I use only an infusion dose, and that is more for a good hemodynamic control, good analgesia for those, because I don't use dex alone. So I use at a dose of around 0.5 to 0.75 microgram per kg per hour. That is my running dose of dex. It gives me good balanced state for monitoring.
Dr. Prasanna, do you use dex?
Yes, I use dex.
Okay.
I use dex for even the most of the cases now. Not only when IONM is used, but all the other cases also. Routinely we use.
So what's your practice, Dr. GK?
Dex we have used, sir, in addition to the propofol, because Dex will reduce the requirement of propofol, and even the fentanyl requirement it will reduce. So we have used Dexam as an adjuvant.
Okay. So why do you want to reduce the requirement of propofol?
Reducing the amount of propofol, two things actually we have observed. One is the more you use propofol, the chance of temperature dropping and even hypotension can also occur. So hemodynamics is better controlled adding Dexam.
No, but Dex also produces hypotension, isn't it?
But not always, sir. In whatever, like we use around 0.4 to 0.5 mics per kg per hour. So with that, I think hemodynamic stability is maintained well.
No, because what I feel is with a lot of infusions, propofol, fentanyl, Dex, something is can go wrong at any point of time. Because always you are away from the patient's end. You really don't have the opportunity to see how your infusion is going on. I have had instances where there was a major leak from a three-way which was connected to a central line, and the propofol was going on the floor. So all those things can happen in TIVA. It's a big challenge, isn't it? Adding multiple pharmacy. Dr. Ajay, what do you feel about this strategy?
Usually, I mean, personally, I haven't encountered such a scenario like you, sir. But like you said, it can happen. But we are always using a depth of anesthesia monitor. So something is going wrong, we can always pick up.
No, that way only I also picked up. Yeah.
And what I believe is whatever we are using, we should be able to achieve a steady state of anesthesia. That is what is more important than what we use. Because once we use a steady state, and we have to hold on to it, because any boluses over that is going to affect our recordings. That is what we have noticed, especially if you're going for clipping. I mean, if you're going for pinning, like during positioning, if you're giving a bolus of propofol and a bolus of fentanyl, definitely it's going to affect your MEP. We cannot comment on it. So those are the instances, like again, if the surgeon is going for aneurysm clipping and you're going for a additional dose of propofol for neuroprotection, it's gone. I mean, there's no point looking at your screen. I mean, so those are the instances which we should avoid. Rather than whatever we are using, we should hold a steady state. And because anesthesia is a global event, it will be reflected in all your four limbs of SSEP.
So irrespective of whatever drug you use, the steady anesthetic state is important in getting a good signal and interpreting the changes in signal. That's what your point is, isn't it?
Yes, sir. And that should be maintained with if the baseline is done in a steady state, and then only we can compare with the intraoperative. Because if the baseline is a different anesthesia, and then if you're going ahead with another point in the intraoperative period, definitely it's going to be different.
I think nobody will refuse, nobody will be against you. I'll go to Dr. Dheeraj. Dr. Dheeraj, please go through us. What does the literature say? What kind of anesthetic can we use? What is the evidence?
So can you see my screen, sir?
Yes, please go ahead. Yeah.
Different agents have different effect on SSEP and MEP. You can see in the slide. So inhalation, overall, they will decrease the amplitude of SCP and they increase the latency. And on MEP, there will be a 2+ reduction in the waveform size. And coming to IV agents, propofol will decrease the amplitude of SSCP, and it will have almost similar effect like inhalation on MEP as well, according to the literature.
But, so as per your slide, almost all the inhalation agents have the same effect.
Almost, yeah. Almost everything is
so there's no difference between ISO or SIVO.
In that, there are minor differences are there. I've gone into the details of that. Among this, desflurane is better, sir. SIVO and DES are better. Between them, DES is better actually.
All right, okay.
The suppression is minimal with desflurane. And coming to IV agents, propofol also suppresses MEP. It is not that it is very safe using propofol. It depends on how much you're maintaining the level, serum levels, basically. That is the main fact.
So two things from the IV agents I see from your screen, where etomidate and ketamine, they actually increase the amplitude.
Yeah, they increase the amplitude. I have some case literature also. So these can be used in certain circumstances, like Nitin told, power less than 3. In those kind of situations, we can add ketamine to the propofol, and you can take a baseline with ketamine and propofol combination, which should give a better wave to you.
All right. So opiates
So that-
also decrease the amplitude. Yeah.
SSCP, but they have no effect on MEP, sir. This is I don't think opioid will have much effect. You should use in a bolus doses, that like high doses of fentanyl, remifentanil mainly is a very
I'll come
potent
to you,
drug.
Ajay. I'll come to you, Ajay. Just wait. Dexmedetomidine is no effect on SSCPs.
Yeah, Dexmed has no effect on SSCP, and MEP
No,
also
it's that it has no effect on SSCP, or it's not studied.
It is studied, sir. But actually, literature in anesthesia and IONM, literature is not so great. There are only very few studies actually.
Okay.
So that
Dr.
is the
Ajay,
problem.
quickly. Ajay, want to make a point quickly. Yeah.
No, I just heard about the ketamine use for potentiation of our signal, especially in patients who are having neurological deficit. But what is the validity of that signal which we are getting? I mean, is there any studies which have shown that using ketamine in this kind of groups is going to, I mean, and potentiating a signal, and then whether it actually turns out?
I think Dheeraj has answers for your questions.
Yeah,
I'll go to
actually,
Dheeraj.
Wants to answer.
so
Yeah.
actually, what Ajay is asking, there is no study comparing the effect of ketamine on the waveform, but there are 3-4 case reports where they mentioned that after giving ketamine, they saw an increase in the wave.
So it's only a
Case reports are there.
Yeah.
But as per no study is there actually. One study is there, I'll show you that. But
Okay.
what the specific question of Ajay, case reports are there. I didn't
Okay.
put those things.
Okay. Is there a next slide? You want
Yes,
to
sir.
present? Yeah.
So
please.
next, one more. This is a study, sir. They compared desflurane and propofol as a prospective randomized trial, and it's a crossover trial. In the same patient, they have seen effect of desflurane as well as propofol.
Okay.
And what they observed is the amplitude of the waveform is decreased with desflurane in the same patient. So the conclusion is that desflurane will decrease the MEP amplitude significantly more than propofol.
Okay.
So you can take some conclusions from this study.
Okay. So I think what is the dose they used for desflurane, or how did they titrate propofol in this study? You have details on that?
Details I think I don't have. I think I didn't go into the full literature of this.
Okay.
But I think they would have maintained 0.6 MAC or 0.7 MAC of desflurane.
All right. Okay. Okay. So you can go to the next slide. Yeah.
Yes, sir. And,
So I'm very happy to share that there are a lot of live chat which is happening here, and I think most of the questions we have answered. If some questions need to be answered, I'll let the panelists know. Yeah, right. Yeah, and thanks Bhagyeshri, thanks Saras, Logan, and others for joining in the live chat. Thank you. Go ahead.
And
Dheeraj.
one more important thing is, actually, I was also doing this before. So sometimes what we do is we start propofol, and on top of that, we add some desflurane to that. Just a 0.3 or 0.4 MAC we keep. So there is a study looking into that. And they found that they made 2 groups, and one group is only TIVA, and one group is a combined technique of propofol and desflurane. And the conclusion in 156 spine cases they have seen. And there is no statistically significant difference in the cortical SSCP as well as MEP amplitudes in this study, sir. So we can conclude saying that we can add desflurane to TIVA actually. We can get the same waveforms. That is one more thing.
Oh, desflurane to TIVA.
Yes, sir.
And this is another polypharmacy, means so much.
Yeah.
Okay, all right.
Some
Okay.
people, I also used to do like this. Like for example, in some situations, I'll tell you, young patient will come and
Okay.
for some intramedullary lesion. So
All right.
with TIVA, you're maintaining the depth of the patient, and addition of desflurane to those kind of people, maybe you're more sure that patient will not bug during the thing. That's my opinion. That's why I found this study.
Okay.
So, and coming to dexmedetomidine effect, there is a randomized trial is there in 71 adult patients, and they have used a dose of 0.5 microgram per kg bolus for 10 minutes and infusion of 0.5 mic per kg per hour. And this was added to propofol remifentanil infusion. So one group will not have dexmed and one group will have dexmed. So there were no significant changes in the amplitude and latency after in the MEP after adding dexmed. So the conclusion is that addition of Dexmed to the regimen does not affect the MEP SSCP. And important thing is the propofol plasma concentration is lesser in the Dexmed group. So you can decrease the dose of propofol by using Dexmed. That is one more. And
no, my point is when you're using Dexmed and propofol, you titrate a number of like Nitin and Prasanna said 40 to 50.
Yeah, actually, I'll tell my technique.
With or without Dexmed, the number is going to be the same, or the number is going to come down?
I'll tell you my technique of doing. I actually extract the EEG from SSCP electrodes C3 and C4, and I see spectral edge frequency 95. I usually keep the spectral edge frequency 95 between 10 to 12 if I'm using propofol technique.
All right.
So most of the times patient will not bug.
So just for Dheeraj, for the benefit of our viewers, just explain about the spectral edge frequency. Now, what is it?
Yeah, spectral edge frequency 95 means most of the frequencies of the, so there are different kinds of frequencies, like starting from delta, theta, alpha, and beta. So in increasing order. So in anesthesia, in a good depth, we should have more. We'll have two kinds of waveforms actually. You'll have a background delta, and on top of that, you'll have alpha or theta superposed on that. So what we actually see with spectral edge frequency is the superposed frequency on top of delta, whether it is alpha or theta, will be same. In propofol anesthesia, what usually happens is an alpha frequency is enough to have a good depth. So what we usually do is spectral edge frequency 95 less than 12. That means that most of your frequencies are less than 12. That means most of the frequencies are within the alpha range. So that is enough for the patient not to move in propofol. And there is a difference. Dexmed, if you add, it will confuse you actually. What happens is people think Dexmed doesn't have effect on EEG, but there is an effect. What happens is you'll get a falsely low SCF. What happens is Dexmed sometimes removes the superposed alpha and directly it will show you a falsely low value. So you'll be thinking that actually SCF is low, but actually patient must be light. So that is why I don't use Dexmed. I use only propofol and fentanyl whenever I'm assessing with SCF.
So you don't use Dexmed?
I don't use propofol and fentanyl. I use
because can I comment?
Yeah, please.
Yes, Dr. Nitin.
Can you see my screen, sir?
Yes, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. So you can see this is a case where we are doing neuromonitoring, and with the same corkscrew electrodes, we are picking EEG. So in the right hand corner down, you can see that this is the spectral edge frequency.
You can show it on mouse. Yeah.
Yeah. So this yellow line, can you see this yellow line?
Yes. Yeah.
So this is a continuous monitor. So every 5 seconds, you get the spectral edge, okay, of the EEG. This is a processed EEG, okay, after Fourier transformation. And this line, below this line, will 95% of the amplitude will lie in this area. So basically what this spectral edge frequency gives us is a number to follow. You can see the number displayed here. Just multiply this by 3. Approximately this will be equal to your BIS or entropy. This is not studied, but this is out of experience, and this really helps us when you do EEG based monitoring. In these cases. So this is a raw EEG you can see, and this is the spectral edge. So this spectral edge you can continuously monitor to monitor your depth of anesthesia. And second thing I wanted to tell was Dheeraj was talking about Dexmed. So I have we at our institute have done one study on ENT patients. So these patients are snorers. They do some sleep studies. So we use dexmedetomidine with entropy guidance, and I have observed that with only Dexmed on these patients, there is definitely a drop in EEG. There is definitely entropy falling down. So there is an effect of Dexmed on EEG, but it has not been published or not studied adequately. So that is one thing.
Falsely, you'll see a low value.
So definitely there is an effect. We should not deny that. Second thing is why Dexmed has to be added with propofol is because Dexmed does not affect neuromonitoring. So we feel more comfortable when you use Dexmed. So it gives you a sense of security. Second thing is when you use more propofol, you are likely to cause more hypothermia, like GK sir was telling, more BP drop. So you want to make the patient hemodynamically stable for neuromonitoring as well as not affect the signal. So this is the challenge that you have when you do TIVA. So that's why Dexmed comes in as a very useful tool for us.
So you feel that adding Dexmed is helping you?
Definitely. Okay. It gives me more confidence that I'm keeping the patient adequately deep as well as facilitating monitoring. That is the whole aim.
But do you follow certain steps, like you start with propofol and fentanyl and you get a good signal, then why should you add Dexmed?
No, I start with propofol and fentanyl, once I tube my patient, I start off with my dex, I get a baseline recording, and so from then on, the dexmed is continuously on until the monitoring is going on.
So
And
it is
then it's your choice.
it is just a regular armamentarium. You don't
Yes,
add
yes,
on to it. Yeah.
yes,
Okay.
yes.
All right. Okay, Dheeraj, go ahead with your slides. Yeah, Dheeraj.
Sir, can you see my slides, sir?
Yes. Just a second. Yeah, I can see your slide. Yeah.
So this is about the Dexmed, and one more study also is there, and it is done on 40 patients on spine surgery, and they have done Dexmed in one group, in another group they have not given Dexmed, and a similar result. Addition of Dexmed to intravenous anesthesia did not affect the above potentials and can be safely used during MEP monitoring. That is the conclusion. And
Okay.
but ketamine, actually, there are no studies. The study is also a 1997 study in Journal of Neurosurgery.
Okay.
So, but case reports are there showing that increase in the waveform size is seen. Actually, 3-4 case reports are there. But this study is actually is showing that addition of ketamine does not affecting the wave, is not decreasing the waveform size. That is what is the conclusion from this study. So,
Can I make a point?
How
Yeah,
much
please.
ketamine? How much ketamine they've used?
1 second, sir.
5 milligram per kg.
0.5 milligrams.
A single bolus,
Sir,
no? Not
Yeah,
any-
single bolus. Yeah, they have given a bolus and they checked after some time.
Can I make a point, sir?
Yes, Dr. Nitin. Yeah.
Sir, I would like to emphasize this point that adding ketamine and adding etomidate to get recordings is not a good practice, because when you get your baseline and you don't get a recording after that, you have to follow your checklist properly and assume that it might be a critical event. So adding ketamine and etomidate, we feel happy as anesthetists that we are trying to do something to potentiate the intraoperative neuromonitoring signals. It should not be routinely practiced or advised, because when you're doing your stable anesthesia and there is sudden drop in signal, you should be really worried, and the neuromonitoring team also should be really worried. So adding this ketamine and something to make good signals is not a good practice. So I don't buy this.
Okay.
Don't
And
follow.
then there are only few case reports. It's not
Yeah,
really
right.
good things.
Yeah.
Okay, right. Yeah.
But one point I would like to tell: if you're adding ketamine, you should add in the beginning only,
Yes.
and not
So-
when the waveform
Okay.
decreases.
Okay, right. Yes, Dr. Ajay, you have a point. Yeah.
I also agree with Nitin on this, and also what I would like to add is in a patient who is having an existing neurological deficit, if you add ketamine and you're getting a signal, it is not going to actually help in the outcome of the patient. One,
Yeah.
and second is ketamine for neuropotentiation is used only if it is an anesthesia-induced suppression of the signal. That is where all the studies have done. Like you give a bolus of propofol or a high dose of propofol, and your signals came down. You are suspecting that after rolling out all the checklists, and then you want to potentiate your signal, then you can use ketamine. That is the scenario in which they have used. But rather than to go to that stage, like Nitin said, we should actually follow the titration of a proper anesthesia rather than going ahead and then getting a good signal and being happy with that, because we are changing our anesthesia from the baseline steady state.
Okay. So
So
that's what our viewers from live chat also say. Dr. Surya is here. He's saying that addition of ketamine should be done before obtaining a baseline, if at all you want to use it. So that's what everybody feels that. So the point is closed. Now, Dheeraj, yeah,
Yes, sir.
go ahead, Dheeraj. Any more slides? Yeah.
Etomidate, I have some slides. A study done on 43 patients, and they observed an increase in the complex, an SSCP study basically. This is, there is an increase in the complex N20 after bolus injection. So a study shows that etomidate also increases the waveform size, but as you said, how much it is useful, we don't know.
Okay.
So that is about, and I
All
also, and yes, sir. About this is about MEP SSCP, and
Okay.
something else about other conditions. But facial monitoring also, you want me to finish now only or after the?
No, we'll come back to you.
Okay, sir.
And I'll go to Dr. GK. Dr. GK, we are routinely using intraop neuromonitoring. Are there any major complications associated with procedures? Lot of leads are placed. You are continuously stimulating the patient. Are there any major complications associated with this intraoperatively, postoperatively, long term?
Yeah, SCCP, there is asset, there is no complication. Only with motor potential, you can have tongue bite and even seizures also. Like if you use high current, if the stimulation current, if you are using is more,
Okay.
then they can have intraop seizures can be there. So
So
that is one. Yeah, yeah.
yeah. So what are the other complications?
Yeah, mainly that's a tongue bite and motor stimulation. You can have seizures, intraop seizures.
Okay.
That is the main two complications.
Okay. All right. So no, it's an important thing. Tongue bite, and as anesthesiologists, we are worried about tongue bite. So, what is your strategy to prevent a tongue bite?
Yeah, we use bite block with the gauze. We make with the gauze,
Okay.
with the gauze rolls. Actually, basically it is.
Okay.
So we make sure that like tongue is pushed in and it is not in between the teeth. That is more important, especially when you are doing prone positioning. It
All
should
right.
not come out.
Dr. Prasanna, what do you do to prevent tongue bite, and how do you secure the tube? Yeah.
Yeah, I do the same. What GK has told, exactly the same.
Okay. And Nitin, you previously told me you had some special device, something like that. Is there a device to prevent that?
Can you see my screen, sir?
Yeah.
Can you see the screen?
Yes. Yes. Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. So coming to complications of what you are asking, so motor evoked potentials. These are the complications that are associated with motor evoked potentials. That is tongue bites. Tongue bites most commonly in prone position or lateral position, because when prone or lateral, the tongue tend to come out and the tongue gets stuck in between the jaw. The thing is, every time you give a motor evoked potential stimulus, the jaw just clenches because the whole motor strip is stimulated. The jaw also gets clenched and the tongue can come in between. We have got severe. I had 2 cases where I had severe tongue lacerations, where we had to call a plastic surgeon to suture up. So we started by using small gauze rolls. Then we started using this 2cc syringe. We used to remove the plunger and roll it with gauze piece. And because it used to give a track that secretion can come out, so we use this. Can you see in the diagram below?
Yeah.
So we started with 1, then we started with 2. But all of this also had, because this is kind of a little hard, so the tongue can come in between this also and cause injury. So then finally we have moved on to this kind of a device where there's a silicone bite block, which is, I mean, it's unfortunately not available in India. I've been persuading biomedical people to make one for us, but I got this from abroad. This is really useful. It just sits into the jaw, and you can, I mean, whatever happens, the tongue will not come in between, and the jaw clench also will, the silicone bite block will absorb all the pressure. So it's a very useful device. I can show you a video also. I have a video regarding how I do anesthesia. Maybe in the end I can show this, how to place this bite block.
So this bite block is only in the front of the jaw. It will
No,
give
it will
protection
actually sit in the whole of your molars and premolars. That is, the whole area will be clenched there, and the tongue will come in between. That's why I position my tube also in the center, and the tube will be free. And actually, I mean, the whole pressure of the jaw clench will be taken by this bite block.
Okay. So I think I also used like what Prasanna said, most of the cases with gauze rolls, but extra gauze rolls, for the molars as well. What,
Yeah,
Ajay?
so
What do you
actually,
do? What do you do? Yeah.
So we also use the syringe like how Dheeraj was, Nitin was telling, and we also have bite blocks. Another complication we have noticed is especially when we are using armor tube, and if the patient bites on the armor tube, the tube itself gets kinked, and that affects our ventilation. Airway pressures are gonna go high, and it's so difficult to undo the kink. So that is another area we should be concentrating on. So the bite block should be put on both the sides, not only on the other side where the tube is not coming out. Like how the Nitin showed, the tube should ideally go in the midline, and the bite block should be on either side on the molars. So otherwise, armor tube getting kinked is a really disastrous scene in the intraoperative period.
Yes, Dr. Prasanna, you want to make a point here?
No, I just wanted to know, are the people still using armor tube in spine?
We have
it.
It's more than 10 years I used armor tube. That's why.
Okay.
No, we don't
Alright.
use for all cases, but some cases we do go for.
Okay, there are a lot of live chat which is happening here, and I think most of the questions we have answered, and some of the questions I'll just ask you about pediatrics. I think we are going to discuss it at a later time, and especially about Dr. Anjani Bhushan want to know about the D waves. Dr. Nitin.
Yeah.
So
So
what's the
what all
difference between?
problems? Yeah. So what all problems we were facing with MEPs? So these MEPs that I routinely showed, we were discussing about is motor MEPs or muzzle MEPs. So the needle electrodes are placed in the muzzle, and then you give a electrical stimulus at the motor strip and record it from the muzzle. But the problem with this is every time you stimulate, there is a jerking of a patient, there is this tongue bite problem, then multiple synapses are involved because after the spinal cord, until the muzzle is innervated, there are neuromuscular junction, there is a synapse at the spinal cord happening. So every time there is a synapse, there is confounders. So BP, temperature, everything will affect MEPs more. So what during neuromonitoring is said is that D wave is gold standard, especially when you do spine monitoring and when you do intramedullary tumors. It gives you an advantage that there is no jerking of the patient. You can still continue your muzzle relaxant, and it is a continuous monitor. It is not intermittent. So MEPs are intermittent. So once you have a drop in signal, you don't know when it has occurred. So it's like retrospectively looking at. Still, you can take corrective measures, but D-Wave will give you a continuous monitoring, and you can take corrective measures at that instance. So those are the advantages that D-Wave gives as a monitoring modality, and as it makes our job easier when you do anesthesia with D-Wave. So people have moved on to D-Wave.
Yes, Ajay, you have a point here.
I have read some literature of antidromal conduction and affecting the D wave and its specificity. So, did you have any experience, Nitin, on that, like D wave and how the specificity is like? Because some of the times now, due to the opposite side antidromal stimulation, also the D wave can come up. So you don't know whether it's the right or the left.
So the point with D-Wave is exactly what you are telling is that is a drawback with D-Wave. So you don't get lateral information with D-Wave because it is bilateral stimulation and you're recording at the corticospinal tract. So you're just looking at one synapse. So basically there is a neuron here and there is an axon continuing in the spinal cord. That is your corticospinal tract. So basically you are looking at one axon and you're monitoring at the lower level of axon when you're doing a spine surgery. So very unlikely that you'll have confounders. It will be more specific, but the drawback is that it does not provide lateral information. So be very careful when you draw lateral conclusions with D-Wave. But when it works very well when you do intramedullary tumors, because many times you have drop in MEP and still patient can wake up without a deficit. So MEPs were not considered to be very specific. But in D-Wave, you know that when there is a 50% drop in amplitude, 100% it will translate into bad outcomes. So D-Wave, you can be more specific as a neuromonitoring modality.
So you are talking about drop in amplitude. So what is a cutoff drop in amplitude where we have to alert the team and initiate the checklist?
So for D-Wave, it is 50%. For MEP and SSCP also, the most common alarm criteria that people use is 50% drop in amplitude and 10% increase in latency. So when you see a wave, look at how late the response is coming and how much big is the amplitude. So that's all you look at. So latency is how late the response is coming after the stimulation. So if you have a later response after 10% compared to baseline, then you say, okay, it's getting late. So the conduction is going to get hampered. So conduction is being hampered. And when the amplitude stop dropping, so 50% drop in amplitude. Amplitude is nothing but the highest peak and the lowest trough. So peak and a valley. So the highest and the lowest point, that is your amplitude, how big it is. So when there is a 50% drop, you say that it might be an alarm criteria. But it's not specific. In MEPs, you have various alarms. Sometimes it is all or none. Sometimes it is 50% drop in amplitude. Sometimes it is even increase in current required to elicit a MEP response. That itself can act as an alarm. So it is not very easy, and you can't.
So all these cutoff values of 50%, all these things are from studies, or it's
studies. Everything is literature. Yeah.
So okay.
So the general alarm will be 50% amplitude.
Okay, I'll quickly go to Dr. GK. Dr. GK, our viewers want to know, when we add Dexmed and Propofol, we do encounter hypotensions. So how do you manage such hypotension? By decreasing the depth, or because of patient, if you decrease the depth too much, you are not using relaxant, there's a risk of patient movement, and or you add some vasopressors to maintain the blood pressure. How do you do that?
Yeah, see, when the depth, we want to, most important thing, we have to maintain the depth also. So most of the time, like we use vasopressor like noradrenaline, low dose. We'll start from the, whenever there is a drop in blood pressure, we'll start. We don't try to reduce the depth of anesthesia.
Correct.
So it's very important to maintain the BP for having a reliable response also.
So use noradrenaline.
Yeah, noradrenaline we'll use.
Dr. Prasanna, how do you manage the intraoperative hypotension which happens with your anesthetic?
I go out of the OT. Sorry.
Mind you, you are on air live.
No, I still use noradrenaline and to get up the BP, the same.
All right. So regarding this, to Dheeraj, I'll go. We are always discussing about anesthetics. How about other agents like noradrenaline, phenylephrine, ephedrine, whatever used intraoperatively? Does it affect your recordings? Is there any study on that?
I didn't do a search, but I don't think they will affect the MEP waveform, I think. But early initiation of noradrenaline is a better approach. So that's what we do. So we don't wait for the BP to fall.
Okay. I always use phenylephrine intraoperatively. I don't know, Ajay, what he used. Ajay?
So we also use noradrenaline. So.
All right. Okay. So you're comfortable with that. Right. So that answers the question. And okay, I think most of the other questions we have answered. And Dr. Nitin, can you just enumerate few points on with respect to scoliosis surgery? Because one Dr. Basanta Manjari Naik, he wants to know about IONM in scoliosis surgeries. So how is it different from others?
So kyphoscoliosis is very challenging because you have multiple levels of fixation, and patients. So monitoring started with kyphoscoliosis. So when we started doing intraoperative neuromonitoring, kyphoscoliosis was the first and the first surgery where MEPs. The monitoring was started. So we started with doing SSCPs, like I told, and then we have moved on to MEPs. So for kyphoscoliosis, always couple SSCP and MEP. That will be my formula. Okay, and this is because SSCP will give you a continuous information, but if you do only SSCPs, you'll miss out on motor deficit, because SSCP is only looking at the posterior cord and motor evoked potentials is specific and it is anterior, so that is what you want. So always couple SSCP and MEP. The advantage of doing this technique is that you get continuous information with SSCP, and with MEP you get specific recording. So sensitivity and specificity both will be very well achieved with this. But if you have a D wave, put a D wave. That will stop all your problems as for anesthetist also, because you can directly tell what is happening above the.
So with respect to this surgery, you might have significant blood loss at some times.
Yes.
So how does blood loss and transfusion affect the
very much? That's a very important point, because more blood loss, more hypotension, and then more temperature drop. So these are very important issues. So when you do a long spine like a kyphoscoliosis, the spine is exposed for such a long time. So many times after getting a baseline, we have lost signals in between. And when we do our checklist, and the temperature may be normal when you put an nasopharyngeal probe, but the local temperature there might have dropped because the spine is exposed for a long time. Then we ask the surgeon to put some warm saline there, and then we get back recordings. So very important issue: blood loss, hypotension, temperature. How much ever you ascertain on these things is less, because it's not only important to give anesthesia for this, but all these factors are also very important when you do anesthesia for this.
When it comes to temperature, does local factor also affect the recordings? Because a local cooling of your hands, even though nasopharyngeal temperature will be okay.
Because so the physiology is you stimulate here and you record at the muscle. So the pathway is through the spinal cord, right? So when you have local cooling at the spinal cord, conduction will be hampered. So you have to maintain temperature locally as well. So I always tell my surgeons to instill warm saline in between, so that we keep the temperature there also normal.
So does this intraop neuromonitoring replacing the wake-up test, or it's an adjuvant to wake-up
100%.
test? Do you still use wake-up test in scoliosis surgeries?
Never, because we have moved to an era where we can specifically tell that patient will have will have a drop. Will have a deficit.
You think that with intraop neuromonitoring, there is no need for wake-up test?
No, not in this era. I don't think we should go back to that era.
Dr. Prasanna, you agree with that, or do you want to make a point?
No, I don't think there is a need for wake-up test anymore.
Yes, Dr. GK.
Sir, one instance actually, whenever there is a drop in the amplitude or latency, or there is a disappearance of evoke potential, so we'll look into the other factors like physiological factors, anesthetic factors, everything we have ruled out, and we are coming into the point to tell that it is due to the surgical insult. So he has retracted, means he has removed any retraction or everything. Still, there is absence of response. Then, in that scenario, you have to do a wake-up test actually, or you should abandon the procedure or remove the implant.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you mean to say that the wake up still has a role?
It has a role, very rare, but it has a role actually.
Yes, Dr. Ajay. Dr. Dheeraj, sorry. Dr. Dheeraj, yeah.
Sir, actually, sometimes what happens is MEP will come down during the surgery. You try to do your checklist, and but after recovering the patient, power will be normal. So such kind of instances are also there. So that is why still wake up is still there in the end of the checklist. So once you do your checklist and you anesthetic and surgical factors, once you rule out everything, sometimes we did twice actually. We woke up the patient and MEP was actually decreased. And in the wake up time, in one patient actually the lower limbs were moving. In another patient, they didn't move. So based on that, we'll take the decision of whether going ahead or doing corrective measures, something like that. So still
means you mean to say that there is a drop in signal,
yeah.
and you want to ascertain that whether the drop in signal is really
Yes,
matters for us, and you do a
whether it
wake up
is,
test.
yeah, it's real or not also we should know. Sometimes there will be a drop and post-op there will not be
No,
motor power decrease.
but that is the purpose we are monitoring, isn't it? If there is a drop in signal, we think that it matters. That's why we don't proceed further. Yeah.
No, there is a false positive responses are there.
So to differentiate between false positives.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Yes, Dr. Prasanna.
Yeah, this wake-up test is something which you cannot just say, I am going to do a wake-up test. You need to be prepared mentally, and you need to prepare the patient. And it takes quite some time before you switch off the agent and get back the response from the patient.
Yes.
It is not something that you will do it in 5 minutes or so. Ideal time frame given when you want to do a wake-up test itself is 30 minutes to 1 hour. So when the responses are not coming, you want to go for a wake-up test, I think it's a very difficult. Having said that, even yeah,
2 cases I waited for 20 minutes in both the cases, and after 20 minutes, one patient, when the patient was waking up, he had a full shivering of the body, and after that he started obeying commands. And another patient woke up smooth only. That is the advantage if you don't have ketamine and all other drugs. Only propofol if you maintain wake up can be a little smoother if you're doing.
So just during wake up, just for the purpose of our viewers, because in centers who don't use neuro monitoring, because I also started with wake up test, then switched to neuro monitoring. So how do you do that, Dheeraj? How do you do your wake up test? You switch off propofol.
You switch off the propofol.
What about the analgesics?
Sir, everything you need to switch off, sir, because otherwise you'll delay the time.
Okay, you switch off fentanyl also.
Everything you need to say. Otherwise, after switching off, also 20 minutes.
In whatever cases I did, 3-4 cases wake up test, I never switch off fentanyl. The analgesics will be continued at a low dose, about 100 mics per kg, to provide him comfort, and I didn't had any problem. Means even with controlled ventilation, he'll be moving his limbs, obeying commands.
Yeah.
Okay, Dr. Prasanna, yeah.
No, that's fine. I think Ajay wants to make a comment.
Yeah, yes, Ajay, Dr. Ajay.
I just want to add one point to the wake up test is, the first thing we have to do is, once we are planning for a wake up test, the first thing is you have to inform the surgeon to undo whatever last step he has done, if it is possible, especially instrumentation. Because if he's waiting for the wake up test to go and happen and undo his screw, by that time the spinal cord is gone after 20 minutes. So
can I come in, sir?
Yeah, just come in. Yeah.
Yeah. Can you see my screen?
Yes. Yeah.
So this is a proper checklist that is standard. Kind of standard, and everyone practices. So at the end, you have a wake up test. So what if you wake up a patient and still patient has a deficit and is not moving his whole limb? The same maneuver, what you would do without doing the wake up test, you will do. So if there is drop in signal, there is a wake up test, and again it also shows that there is weakness on one side. So you will take your surgical or corrective steps and then go ahead and do the surgery or do it. That is up to the surgeons and up to the team to decide what is to be done. So wake-up test will not give you any much added information than I mean, it will give you. I mean, initially when you do monitoring, probably a surgeon's belief will. I mean, you to take that into account and for them to get the confidence, it will take time. But slowly, I think wake-up test has come out of practice, and this is a proper checklist that everyone was mentioning about. Like Ajay said, the first step when you get drop-in signal is the surgeon should stop his manipulation. He should remove his retraction. Okay, and then the anesthesiologist should do his checklist. That is hemodynamics, temperature,
Just
and then anesthetic technique.
somebody's mic is on.
Okay, can you hear me?
Can I add some point?
Yeah, Dr.
Actually,
Dheeraj. Yeah.
Actually, it depends on what surgery is going on. If it is an intramedullary tumor and wake-up is showing no movement in some limb, there is nothing we can do. I think the damage would have happened. If it is a cervical laminoplasty or some other surgery, where there is still scope of extending the laminoplasty or removing the screw, readjusting, if there is a scope of some correction, there is a role for wake-up.
Yeah, exactly, Dheeraj. I want to come to this point because
Yeah.
sometimes when there's no instrumentation involved, like only laminectomies or laminoplasties, when you see a drop in signal, you monitor intraoperative neuromonitory. What can they do? What option does the surgeon has? Dr. Ajay, you said the surgeon has to go to the previous step, aborting the step. But when they're doing only just a decompression, so what option they've got?
That is where actually the entire crux of the thing comes. If you are using for intramedullary tumor and you are getting it, it is just of a diagnostic value. It is not going to help you in any therapeutic way, which has even been told by the American Association of Neurosurgeons. They also told the diagnostic utility of all this is good. I mean, if a spinal cord, if it has happened, we know that the outcome is like this, but it is not going to modify the outcome of the patient. We can only anticipate that this patient is going to have a deficit in the post-operative period. Because once a deficit has happened, I don't think there is much which can be happened unless there is an instrumentation which is in place. That is a scenario where we can actually undo what we have done. If he has put a pedicle screw and it's impinging, and then if we undo it, then yes. But otherwise, in intramedullary tumors and spinal cord lesions per se, I don't think there is much of therapeutic benefit with
No,
our
even in that case, any brainstem surgeries and things like that. So,
Yes.
no, what can they do? They can stop the surgery midway and come out, or no? What should
No,
they do?
no, they cannot. I mean, we cannot ask them to stop midway and come, because if it's a tumor which is like if you go for a CP angle lesion, or if it's a meningioma, or if it's a brainstem glioma, anyway, the damage has been done, and we'll have to ask them to achieve hemostasis when they are comfortable.
So this is a dicey point where it does not really show an outcome benefit. Okay, Dr. Nitin, you have a
Yeah.
point? Yeah.
Yeah, so it is not exactly like that, sir. Why intraoperative neuromonitoring was started, and the principle of intraoperative neuromonitoring is that the signal changes happen before the permanent damage occurs. So that is the whole principle. You should understand this. That still it is something like ischemia and infarction. So now you are in a stage where you can still save some neurons. So whether you stop your surgery when you have drop-in signal or continue your surgery, that is a decision that you have to take on the table. So in an intramedullary case, when there is a drop-in signal, sometimes you stop, sometimes you take corrective measures, and sometimes it has so happened that even you have taken corrective measures and signals have come back, or patient has woken up without a deficit. So it gives you that vital information during that time. So don't, just say that outcomes are not, it's not like that actually. So you get vital
What I'm saying, it is told
No,
by
I'm not saying that, Nitin.
guidelines.
Literature, Ajay is saying. Okay.
They have a class 1 level 1 recommendation for diagnostic utility, and they have a level 2 recommendation saying that it does not have any therapeutic outcome, because all the meta-analysis have come out saying that you can say
I'll tell you an example.
No,
Okay,
it must
so
be individual case.
No, let him finish,
yeah,
Nitin. Let him finish. Let him finish. I'll come to you. Yeah.
Especially, they have especially commented on intramedullary lesions in their guidelines, saying that it does not extrapolate to the outcome once the deficit has been picked up. So this is the guidelines what they say. I mean, now coming to Nitin.
Yeah,
Yes,
I'll
no,
tell you an example, sir. So
yes.
it's a complex situation. I agree. So it will not. I mean, it's a decision that has to be taken. So in one case, I'll tell you when we were doing I don't exactly remember, probably an AAD, and we positioned the patient, and after positioning we lost signals. Okay, so now the surgeon manipulated the position, but even after manipulating the position and making it slightly better, we didn't get back good recordings. We got only mediocre recordings. I conveyed it to him that the recordings are not adequate. He went ahead and did a fusion. Okay, he did the occipito cervical fusion. This is a suboptimal surgery that he has done because we got lost signals during the critical step. Patient woke up without a deficit. So surgeon asked me whether this was false recording and whether patient would have, without the monitoring, he would have done an optimal surgery and come out. I said, maybe take it the other way around. Maybe during the positioning, the critical event happened and you repositioned. Still, I didn't get back the recordings, but maybe that has benefited the patient. So it's very complex actually to, I mean, it's very complex to,
No,
Yeah,
it's
that is
getting
what
very, very complex.
no,
Okay.
that is what I am telling. If it's
Yeah.
an instrumentation or if it's a step which can be undone,
Yeah.
it has to be undone. But if it's an intramedullary lesion, when the surgeon is on the tumor, there is nothing much he can do to undo a chunk of spinal cord which he has taken out. I mean, he cannot
So,
replace it back.
yeah. So for
In that case, Dr. Ajay, I'll ask you a question. Why do you even want to do neuromonitoring in those cases?
Yeah, that is one thing. It is just mainly for the diagnostic thing and also the maximum, like at least it will limit his this thing when he is going
Dissection.
ahead with
Okay.
the.
So it will limit his dissection. So
But
in
it
that
is
case,
not
I'd like
going
to
to
point to a
undo what
scenario.
he has already done. I
Okay.
mean,
So there
uh,
was a scenario where a spinal cord
and
decompression was being done.
I would like to go back to Nitin. Like you said about the positioning part for this thing. I just wanted to know like whether any boluses of any drugs were given. Like usually
No,
we tend to give
I think he must have ruled out all the
I do
checklists.
my monitoring myself,
Yeah.
so I have to take care
So
of the
here also
checklist.
we only use our electrophysiology monitors
No, there
because
was no boluses and
okay.
okay, Dr. Nitin, just we'll go to the other heading. So this is a dicey situation where we can't have we need more data on this. Like I said in one scenario we are doing laminectomy and we lost a signal or the signal went to less than 50% in one of the lead, and after completing the checklist also it persisted. So what they can do, because they're not doing an instrumentation to remove a screw or something, they have to
yeah.
proceed with adequate decompression. Maybe Dr. Dheeraj said maybe they have to extend the decompression and give the benefit of doubt to the patient. Okay, so let's go on to the other questions which we have got. Uh, how about in awake surgeries? Sometimes
Okay.
we have to do motor mapping and things like that. That also falls under the purview of intraop neuromonitoring. So how do you do that, Dr. Nitin? Yeah.
So awake craniotomies, before when we used to do awake craniotomies, we used to keep the patient awake during critical stages. Like we do awake craniotomies for basically eloquent areas, that is motor and speech. So we used to monitor the patient, whether the patient is having any weakness in the upper limb, lower limb, keep telling the patient to move. But now with monitoring, the advantage that you get is you can map. So you have to map out the functional areas first. So what we do at our center is we first map out the areas, hand area, leg area, speech area, and then you do other areas, safe areas first, and then come back to the most functional areas there and do carefully under monitoring. So mapping and monitoring. Monitoring, I'm saying clinical monitoring. So mapping is an intraoperative neuromonitoring technique where you stimulate the brain and give low currents and look for motor movements. So if you are stimulating the hand area, there will be hand area movement. If you are stimulating the speech area, you will have speech arrest. So these are things that are done to map. So awake craniotomy also has moved on from an era where we used to only do clinical monitoring to an era where we do mapping and monitoring. It gives us very good outcome benefit.
Okay. All right. So now I'll go to the topic of using intraop neuromonitoring in pediatrics. So because of the immature nervous system, will intraop neuromonitoring really help in pediatric patient? If at all it helps, what are the cases you have used? Till what age you have used?
Sir, I have used intraoperative monitoring as low as 1 year, 6 months also. Spinal dystrophism is a very good example where intraoperative neuromonitoring is very useful.
You
Like
think
your
it
tether,
helps?
definitely, because there you're using it as a diagnostic criteria. So what you do there is you want to identify the nervous tissue and the non-nervous tissue. You want to identify the phylum, you want to identify the nervous tissue. So what you in tethering, like in untethering, you just want to identify the phylum. So sometimes it is so confusing that the phylum cannot be identified. It is engulfed. Sometimes you have a lipomyeningomyelocele case where the fat is engulfing the nervous tissue. So there
All
you
right.
use it. Yeah.
All right. So I'll go to the anesthetic technique if at all you want to use in pediatrics. So before that, from all the faculties, I'll just get their inputs on pediatric patient. Dr. Prasanna, till which age group you think it will benefit?
No, we are using EMG regularly for all the tethered cord patients and the meningomyelocele. Only is I am not using dexmedetomidine in pediatric age group. That's all. That's the difference. We use propofol and low dose inhalational agent because it's only the EMG. We stimulated response. So I don't like avoid muscle relaxant. Use the low dose of inhalation in combination with propofol infusion. It's my anesthetist technique of
So
choice.
till what age you use? As low as?
I think we have used even for 6 months, even for 2 months, 3 months also we are putting. For all the patients we are putting.
Acha, use propofol infusion or use
infusion
inhalation agent?
Propofol infusion plus
You're
yes.
comfortable doing with propofol?
Yes, absolutely.
In 2 months?
Yes, absolutely.
All right. GK, Dr. GK? GK, you have to switch on your mic, yeah?
Yeah, I've used for 1 year, up to 1 year kid. And for spinal cases, even 8 months, 10 months we have used. Mainly we use fentanyl and propofol. And sometimes balance technique also we have used.
All right. Dr. Ajay?
So we have used, and I think the youngest we had was 2.5 months. It is a meningomyelocele. And here we use free-run EMG, like Prasanna sir was saying, and we use DES, direct electrical stimulation, if the we give the probe to the surgeon and he can identify the nerve structures. And it is good. We put the sacral, we put the sphincter probes as well as lower limb.
No, what was your anesthetic technique?
Anesthetic technique, we go for high dose opioids and sevoflurane less than 0.5 max.
So opioid plus sevoflurane. You don't use propofol?
Not in so young patient.
Okay. He is not comfortable.
Go for
Prasanna
don't mind using propofol. He's laughing, yeah. And Dr. Nitin, what do you do?
Yeah, sir, we all, I mean, like the other panelists, I too use propofol. I use opioids, fentanyl.
Is it safe? Is it safe?
I don't know, sir, but there is not a good other option. I mean, I've used it regularly, but I mean, I know that there is a lacuna in literature.
No, but why here when you are using only EMGs or things like that?
No, the thing is sometimes it's not so simple. Sometimes you'll have to do transcranial MEPs also. So that is EMG is only a surgeon-directed stimulation. Sometimes you want to do a transcranial stimulation and look for anal sphincter. I mean MEP also. So we do both transcranial as well as EMG. So I use propofol at my center. But the problem is how to dose your propofol. BIS and entropy, whether it is validated for these pediatric patients, that's a challenge. Second challenge is the physiological changes with these kids. So the myelination is not complete. So your currents will be more. I mean, so a lot of challenges with pediatric patients. So it's very difficult actually.
Dr. Dheeraj, is there any data on that?
Sir, yeah. Data on anesthesia is not there, but I can tell you what I do. I have one, I'll share my screen.
Yeah, please share your screen. Quickly, I'll go to Ajay and come. Yes, Dr. Ajay.
Yes,
sir, one word about transcranial MEP. Especially in infants less than 1, I mean, when you're using in very young infants, thing is we have to understand that the fontanelles are also not fused. So we should be very careful if you're going for needle electrodes, especially in the scalp for transcortical MEP. And because of the myelination not being proper, transcortical MEP, I don't know how efficacious it is in infants, because the literature is quite lagging in that. But at least for direct electrical stimulation, the circuit is small and you're stimulating near the nerve root.
Okay.
I mean, the number of junctions is less.
I'll just quickly go to Nitin. There are some of the questions from viewers. What is the cutoff stimulation current for pediatrics? Is it?
That's a very difficult question, sir. So there is no cutoff. So I mean,
So
sometimes
as per
we'll have
my
to-
understanding, the discussion which is happening, I think nobody's sure of whether in pediatrics really it is helpful or it's
No,
it's all
no. The basically the physiology is so different. So the
Yes.
electrical stimulation current requirement also goes up very high sometimes. But again, the principles are the same. Get your baseline, and then after getting your baseline, continue monitoring.
okay. That is from
I think
Anjani
DES
Bhushan. And there's other question. Is there any contraindications for doing an MEP?
In pediatric, in overall,
Yes.
overall, they are all relative. Maybe seizures or when the ICP is raised, because this is kind of a seizure that you are giving. So where you're stimulating the motor cortex and then you get stimulation, and so it can induce seizures, it can raise ICP. So think of those situations. Those are all relative contraindications. And maybe patients with fractures and unstable fractures where muscle MEPs can jerk the patient. So these are all the kind of contraindications that we look for.
Okay. So are there any instances where under regional anesthesia we have to do intra-op neuromonitoring?
We have done peripheral nerve tumors. I have done a median nerve schwannoma on the forearm where I have given a block, brachial plexus block, and then I've done peripheral triggered EMG stimulation.
Nitin, stop sharing your screen so that I can see you. Yeah.
Okay, okay, sir. So, so we have done under regional also peripheral nerve block. So basically, you are blocking at the brachial plexus level. So you can lower down. You can do your peripheral nerve work. It can be done.
Okay. So another question is the good questions here coming from Anjani Bhushan, Asmat, everybody. And see, you wait for a time when there is a drop in signal and you undo the procedure and the signal comes back. At what time you say that it's safe to proceed with the surgery?
Very controversial, sir. It's subjective, actually. You can't how much time to wait. So, but the thing is, the basic principle you have to follow is do the checklist well, and again redo the checklist. Sometimes we have lost signals just on simple things like electrical noise. So the electrical socket has picked up noise because something has just been switched on, the warmer is on, something like that. So basically, do your checklist well, and then
all those is fine. When those changes happens, are you under pressure to use some drugs, some steroids and things like that?
No. I think we need to be truthful to the patient than to the surgeon. So I don't use this stimulating ketamine, etomidate. Tell the surgeon. Initially, I used to have a problem and I used to feel uncomfortable telling the surgeon, but now I directly tell them whenever there is a warning. I think we should be frank as a neuromonitoring team that there is a drop in signal. Accept it, because it's for the good of the patient.
No, is there any panicky thing and you start using steroids, some kind of neuroprotection?
No, so when the signals don't come back, so sometimes when the signals don't come back, you take your measures. So some surgeons use steroids, some surgeons don't believe in steroids. So so the corrective measures are not defined. That's why you have a lacuna in literature. So when this drop in signal happen and you take an intervening measure, after that, what happens? You cannot really document it because sometimes it documents and sometimes it's not documented. It's difficult.
Another important point: what is the medico-legal implications of intra-op neuromonitoring? That's a very important thing. Now, because you do intra-op neuromonitoring in some centers don't do intra-op neuromonitoring. Can this be a medico-legal ground for arguing against you in the court of law?
Well, very good question. I'm happy that you asked this question, sir.
No, I didn't ask. One of my viewers asked.
Okay, so there are. I'll just give you a thing that there are three kind of centers who do neuromonitoring. One, where they do it routinely for all cases. They do it for lumbar discectomies also. That's an overkill. But their version is until you know normal, what is abnormal. That is their way. Second centers are where you do it only when it is very. So those kind of centers will do specifically having a high risk of having a neurodeficit. The third center is for medical legal safety. Some in the West are doing this just to say that we have done neuromonitoring, still patient had a deficit, we did our best. So those are the three kind of centers that generally do monitoring. And regarding this question of neuromonitoring and medical legal, so I'll give you an example. So when we did cardiac anesthesia, initially the TE was done by cardiologists. They used to come and do the echo, but now it's an era where the cardiac anesthetists have taken up TE. So are we under medical legal pressure? I don't think so, because we are giving information, real-time information at the bedside. And as a team, you take responsibility. So I don't think it's much of a pressure. Many people have asked me this. As an anesthetist, you are doing monitoring. How will you face the medical legal aspect? I don't think it is. It is such a big thing. As a team, you have to own the responsibility.
No, I'm not talking about that medical legal aspect. I'm talking about the medical legal
Not
aspect with
monitoring.
respect to patient outcome. Because you do a monitoring, irrespective of the monitoring, you had a deficit. Does that hold a case for you in the court of law saying that I've done the best thing to avoid a postoperative neurological deficit, or else a patient who's not been offered a intra neuromonitoring? Because like Dr. Prasanna said, as of now, we don't have a very good outcome data, class 1, level 1 evidence that it is not mandatory, and whether he can take it as a ground to go against you, that he has not offered me an intra neuromonitoring, that's why I developed this deficit.
Yeah. So there are some surgeries where it is considered mandatory. There have been guidelines. So CP angle, I think now we should not do without facial nerve monitoring, because the whole surgery itself revolves around facial nerve monitoring. So if you are doing a CP angle tumor without facial nerve monitoring, I think the patient can ask, why didn't you offer me this? And why didn't you tell me that you're not going to do facial nerve monitoring? So there are some surgeries like that, CP angle, kyphoscoliosis. I think there are strong guidelines in these societies that you should do it in centers where there is neuromonitoring. But not all cases.
Dr. Prasanna, I know you have a point.
Yeah, when you're using this IONM, there are three things which we have to keep in mind. One is the technicalities, the second one is the interpretation, the third one is the intervention, what you are going to do based on the interpretation. So I'm not against the anesthesiologist doing, but sometimes I really do not know how much, because if you see the Western standards, if you go by the recommendation by the American Neurophysiological Monitoring Society or American Academy of Neurology, they have specifically coined a term like IONMP, that IONM professional. So either you can be IONM professional or as an anesthetist to the case. So if you want to do IONM monitoring, fine. I am not against it, but leave the anesthesia job to somebody else. I feel strongly that there are too many intricacies involved here. Either you take care of anesthesia or you take care of a neurophysiological monitoring. That is what I feel strongly.
All right.
And the second thing is to prove that there are so many patients who had the changes, they went ahead with the surgery and they woke up with no deficit. That means there is a lot of confusion regarding the positive predictive and the negative. As far as the negative predictive value is confirmed, no changes happen. You can reliably say that no deficit will be there. But when a change happens, still for the motor evoked potentials, positive predictive values somewhere around 30-40%, sometimes 60%, not much higher. To say that changes happened, the patient will wake up with a deficit. And it is very, what we are gathering the information and trying to translate is from the animal data, which shows that intervention does help. But such a kind of study in future is also not possible in human beings. You cannot subject them to that.
That's exactly the same thing. I was talking to Professor Anand. He was saying that it's not possible to do a study in US anymore. If at all it can happen in India, China, where there is a quite variation in practice. One center does not use and the other center uses it, so that we can compare the outcome. Otherwise, no RCTs is going to come. Okay, I'll go to Dheeraj. He's waiting for us to give the data on pediatrics. Yes, Dr. Dheeraj.
Sir, before going to this, one contraindication actually I would like to tell, it is pacemaker is one of the contraindications, and ICD devices also.
Okay. Okay, I think one of our viewers are asking this. What is a contraindication? Yes, thank you, Dr. Dheeraj. Yeah.
Better to avoid in these conditions.
Yes, yeah.
Because I faced one situation like that in the past. Okay. And coming to pediatric patients, actually anesthesia technique, what I follow is propofol. So I use 2% so that it will cut down the lipid load. And so it will be little safer compared to 1%. And any age I'll use only propofol and fentanyl infusion, 4 to 6 mg per kg per hour. And monitor and depth of anesthesia I will not use in pediatric patients. And coming to this study, this is a prospective single center study. It is done. You can see the screen, sir.
Yeah.
This is done on 15 infants less than 12 years. Mean age is 5 months, and they have done MEPs successfully in these patients. And the current is quite interesting thing in this study is the current that they've used is up to 315 is the mean value. Is almost like adult current, and for sphincter stimulation up to 400 also they used safely. So this is more important thing we can take from this study. This is what I have from
So
pediatrics.
it's understandable. It's an immature nervous system. They want to use higher current. Okay, right?
Higher current, yeah. So that is
Any other slide you got?
So one more about the sedation, conscious sedation in general, from motor mapping Nitin was telling. So for that I have one study. It's a retrospective analysis done, and what they found out is in conscious sedation, even though there is advantage of monitoring the motor power, the currents which are required for mapping is higher compared to general anesthesia, it seems, in this study. So you need a higher current to map the motor cortex.
In conscious patients?
In conscious sedation.
Conscious sedation. Okay. When compared to general anesthesia.
You need a higher current for mapping.
All right. Okay. So now pediatrics we have discussed, and now we'll quickly go to the checklist. Dr. Nitin, when there is a drop in signal, can you enumerate us step by step? How do you proceed?
Yeah. So, 1 second.
So what's the first thing you will do, Dr. Ajay, when there is a drop in signal?
In that scenario, we will first alert the surgeon.
Nitin, start sharing your screen. I'll come back
to you.
Yeah,
I've shared it now, sir. 1 second.
No. Yeah. Yes, Ajay. Yeah.
We will alert the surgeon, and simultaneously we will start looking at our anesthesia parameters also. So it has to be. I mean, it's done simultaneously by the surgical team as well as us. And it's not like we roll out the surgeon, then we come to anesthesia, then hemodynamics. I mean, I feel it happens in parallel. And but the only thing is we should include all these things in our thing, and we should not leave out any. And we look for whether it's a global phenomena or a localized. If it's a global, it will be most probably from anesthesia point of view, or a hemodynamic or a homeostatic point of view, like hypothermia or hypotension or increased depth. Then it will be globally reflected, like it will be like in both upper limbs and lower limbs. And if it is a surgically induced, more from we will have a laterality or a lower limb more than upper limb, and that is how we go about it. Also, I mean, this happens in parallel. It is not like 1, 2, 3 like that. It happens in parallel, all the checklists.
All right. Yes, Dr. Nitin, can you enumerate us step by step?
So whenever there is a drop in signal, first thing that has to be done is the surgical manipulation has to be stopped. The surgeon has to take the alarm, and once the alarm is taken, he stops his manipulation. He stops there, and then he looks for correctable measures. In the meanwhile, this all happens in tandem, like everybody is doing their job. The anesthesiologist looks at his angle. He looks for BP, he looks for temperature, because hypothermia, hypotension, all this will affect our intraoperative neuromonitoring signals. Then also sometimes there is an anesthesiologist handover. Some new anesthesiologist comes over, he forgets that there is monitoring, he gives a bolus. So there is an anesthetist angle to it. Next, there is a neurophysiologist angle. So he has to look at the technical aspects. He has to look at if there are misconnections, if there are any technical aspects. And then finally, the electrical noise, all this also has to be taken. So there are 4 people involved and 4 people responsible whenever there is an alarm, and each one takes their own corrective measures. And then finally, if there is no improvement, then you, as we discussed, whether you give steroids, whether you wake up patients or you abort surgery, that's a decision that a surgeon or a team has to take on that moment. So, and one important thing I would like to tell is, like Ajay said, to have a control is very important. So whenever we do MEPs, we keep, even if you're doing lower limb MEPs, we keep one muzzle upper limb MEP, so that if we have upper limb MEP and we are not having lower limb MEP, that means definitely there is some problem with the surgeon. It's not a global event. So global events will be anesthesia, temperature, hemodynamic, metabolic, or electrical, or these kind of things. So when you have surgical things, it will be very specific. So having control is very important. Second thing is to communicate. So we have to be frank. We have to communicate that there is a drop in signal. So initially there might be a hindrance that we don't communicate, or we try to do something and get the signal. But I think it's important to communicate to the surgeon, because we lose valuable time where corrective measures can be taken. I'll give you an example, like for an aneurysm surgery, when you put your temporary clip. So suppose you are giving a neuroprotection, the EEG goes off. It's already have created a burst suppression, and then you're only depending on your SSEP. So you're looking at evoked potentials. So at that time, it's very important to to keep continuing monitoring SSEP, and then communicate. There's a drop in SSEP. Directly communicate to the surgeon that the temporary clip should probably be.
All right, Nitin. Yeah, Dr. Ajay. Dr. Ajay. Yeah.
I would like to add a point on when we are using SSCP MEP for aneurysm clipping. Most often what happens is we don't give neuroprotection if the expected clipping time is less than 5 minutes. So what happens is like if you are having a neuromonitoring and you are going ahead with neuromonitoring based restriction of your clipping temporary clip, then we should not give a bolus neuroprotection. If you're going to give a propofol bolus at that point of time, we will not be able to comment on the MEP also, because that is also going to get affected. And similarly, SSCP also. So we have to choose between whether to go for a neuroprotection and go ahead and believe that the neuromonitoring is, the neuroprotection is working, or we'll have to wait for the neuromonitor to pick up some kind of ischemia, alert the surgeon, and then go for neuro.
Can I come in on that, sir?
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yes.
what actually EEG monitors is gray matter, and gray matter, as we know, is very highly perfused and it is very susceptible to ischemia. So once you give your burst suppression, so the EEG drops, but still the evoked potentials will keep coming, because it is also the subcortical things that are being monitored. So the advantage of evoked potential monitoring when you do aneurysm is that even though you lose EEG with burst suppression, you can still continue doing a revoked potential surgeon with the temporary purpose, definitely causing ischemia.
Stop
Yeah.
your screen sharing and talk because yes, I'm getting your voice repeated. Yes. you talk.
Can I see?
The thing is like when we are giving propofol bolus, that is when it comes. Like you are going to give a bolus of propofol for neuroprotection. The aneurysm has ruptured. You are giving a bolus for propofol and thing. It is going to reflect on your MEP also. We cannot like say for sure whether the bolus of propofol only actually extrapolated into the loss of amplitude, or is it the aneurysm clipping.
So that time your baseline will be pre-temporary clipping. You are getting your SSCP value there, and then compare it post-temporary clipping. And without giving,
I'm not telling about SSCP. I'm not telling about SSCP.
No, MEP. Be very careful when you're doing.
That is what I'm telling.
And the patient moves. So I don't do MEP.
Yeah, that is what I'm saying.
Okay.
MEP should not be like tried out in that.
Okay, understood. Nitin, you had some video to show. Yeah, proceed with that. Yeah.
Can you see my screen, sir?
No, not yet. Yeah.
1 second.
So thank you all our viewers for asking so many questions. It's been fantastic. Thank you. It gives us more enthusiasm to run. Yes. Dr. Nitin, if you're ready.
Yeah. So I'm just showing a brief video of how we do neuromonitoring at our center. This is based on
Nitin, just hang on. There is some echo which is coming from your side. And I don't know what's the reason. Just check out if there is some problem from your end.
Okay. I think.
Okay, proceed with the video then.
Is it still echoing?
No. Just carry on. Let us see.
Okay. I'll not talk much then. So this is TCI based propofol. So even for pediatric cases, there is a PET fuser model that can be used. Marsh and Schneider, as we know, commonly used. We use Schneider at our center. I'll also show you how bite block placement. And also I'll show you how we do anesthesia monitoring.
Yeah, proceed. Yeah.
So doing TCI based will give you an advantage. You'll be more. You don't have to calculate a lot. Thing is, whenever you disconnect your propofol infusion also, when you reconnect, TCI machine will again give a bolus and maintain the serum concentration. So this is the bolus being given. You can see the concentration goes up to 3 microgram per ml. So a bolus and then this is how the bite block is placed. In between the jaw and the tape to the side.
Some problem is there. Can you see?
Yeah.
Okay, so these are the SSCPs, MEPs that we were doing. And this is the EEG based spectral edge frequency monitoring with plane of 4. So this is my screen, 0 mark. And this is an example that I was saying. When your syringe is over, you have disconnected back. The TCI pump will again sense that you have reconnected back to the bolus.
You should not push, I think, in between.
All
So I
right.
also use muscle relaxation monitoring and depth of analgesia monitoring.
I think Nitin, just check your mic. Otherwise, your speaker out must be repeating because we're getting a lot of echo. Yes. Okay. So I think today's discussion was very fascinating. We discussed a lot of things about the anesthetic technique, the anesthetic agents we use, TIVA, what's the best technique, complications, bite block, NAVIC surgeries, pediatrics, and how to go about with the checklist. So I'll get final comments from my panelists before I wrap up the discussion. Yes, Dr. Prasanna.
Yeah, the IONM monitoring is going to use more and more. Yeah, IONM monitoring is going to be used.
Sir, echo is coming with everyone.
Okay, quickly we'll wrap it up. I don't know what there is some issue. Somebody's laptop speaker is on. Okay, yeah, carry on.
Yeah, I think IONM monitoring is going to more and more, and it is going to use more, but we need to carefully select the patient for having an optimal outcome. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, Dr. GK.
Sir, although there is no IONM monitor will have a better outcome, but still we have to use in the cases where it is indicated.
All right, Dr. Ajay.
IONM is the future, and as anesthesiologists, we are one of the biggest team players which is going to get involved with it. So I think we should be more and more well versed with the IONM and what is our impact on it, and I think that is going to change the way surgeries are going to go ahead.
Yes, Dr. Dheeraj.
A lot of echo is coming.
Yeah, I know. I don't know.
My conclusion point would be stable anesthetic depth maintenance during the maintenance IONM is more important. And also early initiation of
Yeah, Dr. Nitin, your final comment.
Yeah, I would like to summarize to get optimal interrupt monitoring. We have.
Can you use headphone?
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes, you can hear.
Okay. So just to summarize that, to get optimal intraoperative neuromonitoring, we have major roles as anesthetists, and more and more intraoperative neuromonitoring is going to be used. So we have to be aware of and the techniques and to titrate our anesthetics better.
All right. So let us end the class today. Very good discussion, and I'm really very happy about the overwhelming response from the viewers. and keep supporting us. We'll come up with a different topic on the next classroom. Till then, good night. And I'm very sorry for the last minute echoing and things like that. There is a problem with somebody's mic. Let me sort that out. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye bye.
Bye.